Today's podcast of Hellbent for Horror is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Hellbent for Horror. Audible has over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Hi, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror. I'm S.A. Bradley, and I'm a lifelong movie lover, but my heart belongs to horror. My biggest thrill, however, is getting to talk to people about this stuff. I really want to start conversations with you. Today on Hellbent for Horror, we complete a two-part discussion about the two directors who gave birth to the look and the style of what became known as Universal horror movies. And that's Frankenstein and Dracula's daddies. That's James Whale and Tod Browning. This is a joint interview with the Wrong Reel podcast, hosted by the very talented, very knowledgeable James Hancock. You know, just like it took two movie studios to bring the world the towering inferno, talking about these two directors that gave birth to horror movies in mainstream Hollywood was just too big for one show. So we thought it would be fun to do a creature double feature in honor of them with our two podcasts. And the first part of this discussion, which is about the horror movies of James Whale, was recorded for the Wrong Reel podcast, and we will have plenty of links so you can hear the show in its entirety. Today, James Hancock is on the show to talk about the horror movies of Tod Browning with me. James, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. And I just want to toot our horn a little bit and say that I think we're actually breaking new ground in the world of podcasts because, to my knowledge, no two podcasts have ever collaborated on a horror franchise such as this. So I like the fact that we're experimenting with some cross-promotional opportunities. And yeah, it is a pleasure and a privilege to appear on Hellbent for Horror.
Well, great. And I love Wrong Reel. Tell us a little bit about Wrong Reel.
It's a podcast we started about 2 years ago, and initially it was just a couple friends sitting around reviewing movies and talking about flicks. But as the podcast has evolved, we maintain that, but at the same time we also invite on filmmakers and actors and podcast hosts and writers, basically anyone who has a intense passion for film or a project they're trying to promote is welcome to come on. So now it's kind of a hybrid of sometimes it's familiar faces just shooting the breeze about movies, and other times it's an opportunity for people to promote whatever it is they're working on. And we try to do between 8 and 12 episodes a month, and I absolutely love it. It's kind of the thing that gives my life purpose, and it is a great honor to be one of the hosts of Wrong Reel.
I've got to say it's amazing, and I am highly intimidated by the amount of output that you guys have. That is definitely fueled by an obsessive passion, a real love, and so you can really feel that on all of the episodes that I've listened to. So let's jump into Tod Browning. He's kind of a harder sell than James Whale is in some ways, but I think he's just as fascinating, and he's a little bit more provocative. And why I say he's a little bit of a harder sell, James Whale has a certain Hollywood elegance that's associated with him. His movies have a certain elegance to them, but Browning really revels in the seedier side of showbiz and life, and that means he also works on kind of gut-level emotions and gut-level themes. If I was to look at these two guys, think of Whale as the brain, very studious intellectual thought in his movies, and Browning is more like gut. He's kind of like EC Comics. He's like Tales from the Crypt stuff. But it's not just that these are morality tales like you would get, and the retribution is certainly grotesque like it would be in EC Comics, but there's more to it than that. Why I really like him is that he tells ugly truths. He's talking about two different types of ugly in his movies for the most part. There's exterior ugly, and there's interior ugly. And exterior ugly is okay. It can even be love, but interior ugly is irredeemable and will get you punished. So what movie did you first come to out of Tod Browning's horror movies?
I saw Dracula from the early 30s, not until fairly late. I think it was about 19 or 20. And when I first started getting really interested in movies, I realized I needed to go back and do my due diligence and see some of these essentials. But it wasn't long after that I caught Freaks, which really caught me off guard. It's a movie that is wildly controversial and hasn't lost an ounce of power in the 80-something year interim since its initial release. It's an extraordinary movie in so many ways. But it wasn't until we started preparing for this episode that I went back and started watching some of his collaborations with Lon Chaney, and it came to me like a bolt of lightning just how much I'd been undervaluing and underrating the career of Tod Browning. I feel like as much as people might know him for his talkies from the 30s, you really don't know Tod Browning until you've taken a crack at some of his silent films, and I am completely reevaluating and reassessing where he stands in my hierarchy of great silent film pioneers.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm glad to hear that, because that's kind of how I feel about Tod Browning, is that he's kind of forgotten. He's one of the few film directors that successfully made the transition between silence and sound. A lot of guys could not figure out what they were going to do. They were handcuffed by these ridiculously large microphones and ridiculously large cameras that were like in big boxes. But he still gets overshadowed because he's overshadowed by the legends and the icons that he helped create in his movies. So silent films, you mentioned Lon Chaney. He helped Lon Chaney. He worked on 10 movies with him. And before he worked with Browning, he was kind of not a bit player exactly, but he was always in the background. And Browning actually gave him the permission to become that man of 1,000 faces. And then he directs Bela Lugosi in Dracula, which is the first sound horror movie. It was the first Universal horror film that beats Frankenstein by 3 months. But you think of Lugosi if you think Dracula, and rightfully so. And if you think about the silent films at all, chances are most people don't even know about his silent films or think about them. You're really going to mention Lon Chaney. It's going to be Phantom of the Opera and Hunchback. Neither of those are Brownings. So when you hear the name Tod Browning, it's either going to be you're really good and you know you give him his due for Dracula, but for the most part you know about the movie that ended his career, Freaks. That's what he's known for. And it's really interesting to me that it's almost like history kept trying to forget this guy, and he kept pushing forward. If you look at when he was coming up, the idea that he had this Ugly is Beautiful, which Jean Genet and John Waters talked about a lot. He had this Ugly is Beauty pretty early. And he was making these movies when World War I vets were returning, and there were the ugly acts in most cities where you couldn't be deformed and crippled or have your face blown off and be seen in public. You'd have to wear masks. I think Boardwalk Empire started to show a little bit of that, where there were artists who would create half faces for people who their faces blown off. They were considered the monsters. And yet Browning, who was probably the most exploitive guy possible, he grew up in the circus and things like that, he had a heart for it. And in a weird way, I think he kind of gives Federico Fellini permission to be Fellini. He gives Jodorowsky the ability to be Jodorowsky without being considered. He kind of took the slings and arrows for those guys. He was like the first guy to step over that border. So I don't want to talk too long on that kind of thing, but that's kind of where I go with on him. His themes seem to be unpopular, and especially for the times.
Yeah, I love the fact that he's literally one of those classic cases of somebody who ran away to join the circus. Apparently he came from a family of means, and around age 16, he just left all that behind and took off, and he was a performer for a long time. Apparently he was even billed as the living corpse.
Yes.
A period where he performed as a clown for Ringling Brothers. So this is a guy who really knows that carnival and circus world. And at least in terms of the silent era and in the 30s, I can't think of a filmmaker alive who did a better job of capturing the world inside that environment, and as you said, the ugly externally and the ugly internally people that one would encounter. And so in a lot of ways, he's kind of the first filmmaker to really tackle these showbiz movies. They just happen to be showbiz movies with, people with no arms and, people with, all sorts of physical deformities. And I find it a fascinating insight into a world that is not explored anywhere else that I can think of. And the fact that Lon Chaney, the characters he portrays in those movies is not like they're big, heroic Douglas Fairbanks type of characters. They're often really, really savage, intimidating individuals. And I love the fact that you have this massive movie star at the absolute top of his game who's willing to go so completely, totally over to the dark side in some of the characters he portrays in these Tod Browning movies.
Oh, yes. I think it was a big turning point. It was really a big turning point for Lon Chaney when he got introduced by, I think it was Thalberg, showed him Browning.
Young Irving Thalberg
got to
put them together.
Yeah. And it was after there was a movie that Chaney had that was kind of his breakthrough. It was The Miracle Man, and he was playing a con artist who was a contortionist for a fake faith healer. And what he wasn't double jointed, but he would move his body in such ways to make these pops. And people actually fainted during the making of that movie. It was the first time he really got a major applause and notice in critical response. And so when he met with Browning said, you know what, you should go down that path. The dark side seems to work with you. The heavies seem to work with you. You've been playing polite people, but there's an edge when you play something dark. And so they first worked together on a movie called The Wicked Darling. And of course, he's known for bringing circus people to life, but he also, Wicked Darling is all about dope addicts and streetwalkers, people who are homeless. That was a bad guy role for Chaney, and he started getting a little bit more response. Now, there's several movies that they did together. They did 10. The Unholy Three is fun, but I think one of the reasons it gets talked a lot about is because it does have that carny atmosphere to it. It's circus performers where he's a ventriloquist, and they have a front in a pet store or something like that, and they're stealing jewels and murdering people, and they're dressing as old women and stuff like that. It's a decent movie. It was a big hit for them, but I think he's got darker ones that I think he's a little bit better in, and that's the ones that I really want to talk about. Although one of the things that I wanted to bring up about the Unholy Three is it's the first time that you meet the actor who's going to be Hans in Freaks. He plays the baby. So without any further ado, the one that I really wanted to take a look at was The Unknown, because there's something very EC Comics about that, and there's something, what I think is interesting about Browning is he could make this a movie about someone being slighted, and then there's a comeuppance. But there's always like this flip. There's one more comeuppance coming, and it's usually incredibly tragic. And I think that The Unknown has that. What did you think of The Unknown? Can you give us your impressions?
I was floored by The Unknown, and I just kept thinking to myself, why is this not ranked amongst the best silent films ever made? It's like you said, it's very much like an EC Comics, Tales from the Crypt, Masters of Horror. It's very short, but it has this incredible premise where you have a criminal who is hiding out in disguise at a circus, and he's hiding out as essentially a performer with no arms. And he uses guns and he uses knives with his feet to perform with Joan Crawford. Very early performance for Joan Crawford, who's absolutely lovely. And she has a phobia of men's hands. She just can't abide the notion of men's hands, particularly men's hands on her person. And of course, Lon Chaney's in love with her. And it's this kind of classic scenario where she's very comfortable around him. But then we learn he actually does have arms. He keeps them behind in a harness, and it's very much he's in hiding and he's in secret with his assistant. And the moment that shirt came off and I saw the harness, I was like, oh no, this isn't going to end well. Something tells me these arms are not going to be with him the entire movie. There's this sense of ominous doom and just disturbing horror just lurking around the corner. And I just love the fact that he's playing a down-and-out repugnant villain. I mean, he murders Joan Crawford's father, chokes him to death, and he's got a physical deformity. He's got a double thumb on his left hand, which makes him very easy to identify. And yeah, just from the moment I saw that he was both in love with her and also she had this phobia, I knew something horrible was going to happen. And of course, it leads to elective surgery to have his arms removed. And I mean, I don't want to spoil the entire plot, but it only gets darker and stranger and more disturbing from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely amazing, and you're hitting on all the right parts on that. Visually, the movie, I mean, that's what I really think Browning was doing very interestingly, is he kept that camera, although he doesn't move it like Whale does, he has motion within the frame all the time. It kind of reminded me of on Sternberg in certain spots. There was a spot where our armless, Alonzo the Armless, which is Chaney, is sitting on like this weird spinning platform where Joan Crawford is on the other side of it, and the background is spinning constantly, and she's tied, and he's taking with his toes, throwing knives and taking her clothes off a little bit and making her pose in different ways. And it's absolutely dizzying what he does with the camera there, in a very simple thing. But you also get this thing of, this is this weird, dizzying relationship. He's kind of throwing all this stuff and she doesn't necessarily notice it. I think what's interesting about Browning's movies, especially this one, is that it's always about relationships. They're really about twisted relationships. And you have people who cannot accept that the relationship isn't going to work out. And the more that they resist that, the worse things get. All of a sudden you're getting elective surgery. All of a sudden you're ready to get somebody else's arms torn off. And there were, I think it's funny that, I think at the end of the movie, there's that whole thing about men's hands. It's constantly happening. And it just gives you this weird feeling that something terrible happened to her. It's not just hands. It's hands upon you. And it takes, the pushing that is supposed to be almost sabotage that Chaney's character Alonzo is doing to Malabar the Mighty, the strong man. He's telling him all the wrong stuff. He's like the reverse Cyrano. He's telling him, go grab her, do all this stuff. And he's trying to sabotage that so that he can have this woman. And in the end, not only does he deform himself, but he finds out that he's the reason that this guy consistently went that direction, and that she needed a push through to get over this hands thing. She needed to see his gentleness and his persistence.
I mean, one of the most jaw-dropping scenes for me by far is when he's returned after his surgery. He's been gone for a long time, and she's so thrilled to announce her engagement to the strongman. And you're sitting there, and the strongman's rubbing his hands all over her body, and she's clearly totally into it and embracing it and kind of writhing with pleasure almost underneath his embrace. And she's so thrilled and so happy. And you see this transformation on Lon Chaney's face. He's trying to smile and act as if he's happy for what is essentially almost a surrogate daughter in a lot of ways. And slowly that smile just starts getting more and more warped and demonic. And it becomes this just abject expression of pure terror and like this horrible realization of what he's done to himself. And it almost looks like he's going mad on camera right before our eyes. And so as much as Lon Chaney might have a performance that is an extraordinary physical performance in terms of pouring drinks and smoking cigarettes with his toes. I mean, what he's able to do with his legs and his toes, just as an actor, that alone is remarkable. But his performance as a dramatic actor on his facial expressions is even more remarkable. So yeah, Lon Chaney, obviously they've made movies about him, The Man with a Thousand Faces, but it seems like a lot of people only talk about his son because he was the Wolfman and he's just he was known in some later movies. Lon Chaney, the actor, is just a godlike performer, and I don't know why people don't talk about the unknown more frequently.
Yeah, the movie absolutely blew me away, and the scene that you're talking about was, I think, what really cemented it. The facial features, the expressions that are changing on Chaney, that's real acting, and twice Browning and Chaney get that, and it's going to be the next movie that we talk about as well has a moment like that. But there is this that crushing thing. I think he says something, he starts laughing uncontrollably, and she's like, oh well, Alonzo's just thinking about how much it took to get us here, he's fine. And then he does say, yep, I'm fine. He goes, there's just this stinging thing that was right about here, and he points his toe at his heart. And you're like, oh man, it's like a whip slash. But not to end the illusion too much, but that was actually trick photography for his legs. It was actually a contortionist that he had half of the chair was the guy, and the other half was him bending himself in such a way so that he would look like he was the top part. So
that's like, even more credit for Tod Browning as a great filmmaker, learning how to bake. Because I was completely sold on that bit of trickery and that bit of illusion on their part. So that's very, very clever sleight of hand from a filmmaking standpoint. So yeah, maybe takes away a little bit of the shine from Lon Chaney, but it makes Tod Browning all the more impressive.
Yeah, I thought it was fantastic, and it's all about the emotions that they're able to exude. And I think they kind of hit a high mark in a movie that we're going to talk about now called West of Zanzibar. I think that this was just the look of it. It's up there with Wages of Fear and how it makes the jungles look and how people look. They look so naturalistic. But there is this real venal nature to the character that Lon Chaney plays. And before we did this show, we were exchanging messages, and you said something that really colored the movie for me when I watched it again, and I thought was a very astute observation. You said, just watched West of Zanzibar, staggering movie, not a strict horror film, but easily one of the most savage films of the silent era. In some ways, it reminds me of Park Chan-wook's Old Boy. Yeah. And I think that this is one of those things where it takes a demented path that if Browning was being a moralist, he would have stopped halfway through that movie. Instead, it goes all the way to the end and goes further than I think most people would expect. So give the audience a little bit of an explanation of what you saw in that film.
Well, it's a classic story about revenge and how if you become consumed with revenge, it almost you can resemble a snake eating its own tail. But it begins with Lon Chaney being betrayed by his lady, and she's basically going to run off with a man played by Lionel Barrymore, and it leads to a really, really violent confrontation where Lon Chaney gets thrown over a banister and loses the use of his legs. And he finds his I can't remember if she was his bride to be, if she was the fiance or not, but he finds her later on after she's died and she's given birth, a baby that he presumes is the child of Lionel Barrymore, who's off in Africa now hunting for ivory. And so he makes up a mind that he's going to build himself up as essentially a titan of industry and a saboteur to deprive Lionel Barrymore of his livelihood in the heart of darkest Africa and an environment that's very much still prone to like voodoo religions and cannibalism. And it's like every kind of Joseph Conrad Heart of Darkness nightmare fable you can think of, it takes that to this almost like Joseph von Sternberg extreme. And so you have this clash of these two men in this inhospitable environment. But as the plot evolves, you are introduced to the grown-up version of the daughter, or the quote-unquote daughter of Lionel Barrymore. And part of Lon Chaney's revenge scheme is not only to deprive Lionel Barrymore of his livelihood, but also to ruin the life of his daughter and make her get addicted to alcohol and basically try to reduce her to complete and total utter ruin. And then the plot only gets more complex and more complicated from there. But seeing Lon Chaney drag himself around on his legs, it's a remarkable physical performance. And I like how all the locals call him Dead Legs. And he just got a shaved head and some creepy expressions. I know he obviously was a master at doing little like enhancements to his face, but it's not like The Mask in London After Midnight or the expression in Phantom of the Opera. It's really just an extraordinary performance on his part. And this is easily my favorite Tod Browning movie. I know Freaks is his most famous, but I think West of Zanzibar, of the movies I've seen, is by far his strongest.
Yeah, I feel this is one of his strongest, definitely. And the look of Chaney is truly amazing. If you see him in the very beginning of the movie, he's Froso the Clown. He's a professional magician, or Froso the Magician. He's got the old disappearing girl box where on one side of it there's a skeleton, and then the girl gets into the box in front of the audience, and the panel switches, and when he opens it up, there'll be the skeleton. That becomes a little bit more important to the plot later, but he is such a different person in the very beginning of that movie. He's doting over this woman who does not really dote over him, and he's like, you're too tired, here, let me take the stuff out to the car and all this stuff. And he's so open and happy, but he becomes this. His face is soft until he gets his legs and his back broken, and then he becomes like you mentioned, snake eating its tail. He looks like a cobra. He's got this bald head. But
he does have that brief shining moment though, like when he first loses his legs. We see him before meeting the baby and the dead girl. Yeah, how he's still kind of refined and still kind of soft. It's only after he finds the child that he really turns into this monstrous human being. Yeah,
it's really interesting because of the level of the revenge that he wants to take. It reminded me on a repeat viewing of Walter White in Breaking Bad. that there is this guy who has been nice all this time, thinking that he's going to get a reward for being nice. And when the world doesn't work out his way, he decides he's going to be a villain. And when he does, he decides that he's going to just crush anybody who gets he needs to have revenge on. They have not taken him seriously. So, of course, in this movie, he uses his magician powers to wile the natives into thinking that he has certain abilities. There is a twist that happens later on, which is where we have this remarkable moment again of this is silent film. This is all done with facial features and just cards that basically have some of the dialogue on it. But you basically have Barrymore and Chaney in a final moment where through this entire movie, Chaney has been messing with this guy's business for Ivory, and he's been letting him know pretty much. He's not hiding the fact of who he is. He says, this is where I am, you come get me. And before he does that, he finds this girl and he ruins her, all to get one look out of this guy's face to destroy this man. And there is a twist that happens. And they play it so well, Browning plays it so well, that when Barrymore hears this thing that's supposed to be happening, he's impacted and you see him stagger away. And you're like, here it is. This is the crushing moment. And then he is in a paroxysm of laughter. He is not crying. He is laughing so hard because the joke is actually on this guy. And just like Walter White, all of his problems are his, created by him. This venality, once he's slighted once, he takes the rest of the world and destroys it, and in essence destroys himself. And the visual image of him just in this dirty house, and I don't know what he's done, but he's got a doctor who needs to keep him alive. He has blackmail on that guy. Everybody is under his grasp. He has two guys that are tattooed. They look like they could murder him in his sleep, but they don't. Instead, they do his bidding. And he has this tribe on a very, very tenuous grasp. The wise man, the first time they meet, there is a look in their eyes that it's like, are you the bullshitter or am I the bullshitter? There's just this weird look that they have, and that becomes very, very important at the end of the film when things don't necessarily work out that well for our vengeful guy. And I think that's one of the things that is a theme that you see in Browning's work. Not only that this relationship, but if you can't let something go, it will destroy you. And it goes dark very quickly.
It reminds me of the Edgar G. Ulmer film Detour.
Oh, yeah.
How he describes how no matter what you do, fate will always stick out its foot to trip you up. And you have a situation there in west of Zanzibar, and I'm going to go into spoiler territory, so mute me if you don't want to hear about some of the plot details. But not only do we find out that this girl whose life he's ruined is in fact his biological daughter that he could have had a relationship with this entire time, but that as a result of killing Lionel Barrymore, everybody is so convinced that she is Lionel Barrymore's daughter that according to local custom and ritual, she must be burned at the stake or on a bonfire alongside of her father, because in their culture, when a man dies, his wife and his daughter get burned right alongside with him. So you have now a situation where this insane magician must try and find a way to save his daughter's life, even at the cost of his own. So we do get a situation where he has a chance to redeem himself, but we see just how all of his efforts at revenging himself upon his hated enemy have totally backfired in every way possible. And it's really, really bleak stuff. I mean, I feel like 20 years before the great heyday of film noir, Tod Browning is very much playing in that sandbox.
Oh, yeah. And he was doing this, of course, pre-code. And so he was able to go down some morally repugnant roads that probably would have been shut off to him. And that brings me to his most famous film, and in my opinion, his weakest film. That we will be talking about today. Obviously, some of his silent films and movies that he did after Freaks, I think, are quite weak. But this is the movie that he's most known for. And it also, once again, the overshadowing kind of happens. It even happened on the set. It was a very troubled set. The death of Chaney was a big blow to Browning. Dracula was supposed to be Chaney. and that wasn't going to happen, obviously, because he died. He went into a deep depression over that and his father's death, and alcoholism finally started to take Browning over. So there are many scenes in the film that might have actually been shot by Carl Freund, who's the cinematographer, because he would just get up and leave the set. He would tear scenes out of the script and say, we're not doing that. That's absolutely redundant. So he was kind of on a self-destructive path at this point, in a time when there was a lot of unsteadiness in the industry because of the stock market crash, as well as the depression is hitting. All of the studios have to cut back, and this is an unknown, untested property. The idea of horror being put out in mainstream Hollywood. So there were a lot of detractors. They even had problems with Bram Stoker's wife. She got screwed over by F.W. Murnau, which was an unofficial version of Dracula named Nosferatu. And so when they came for the rights, when Lemley came for the rights, she's like, yeah, for, I think it was like $200,000 at that time. And like, well, we can't do that. They got lucky in finding Lugosi wanting to reprise that role from where he made it very famous, which was on Broadway. He became a mediary, and he was the only reason that she relinquished the amount and got it down to like $60,000. They were actually able to do it. So struggle in this movie, and top it all off, it's a movie that gets hit by the censors for the code. And so some of the things that they wanted to do never make it. Fangs can't even be shown. At one point, they weren't even going to be allowed to have Renfield attacked because they thought there were homosexual overtones to that. And so there were all of these things that were pushing down on a guy who was obviously very, very free at one point when he was doing these silent films. And now he's got this yoke around his neck. And it's also a thing about how small the world is. Jack Pierce worked on Dracula before he went on to do Frankenstein. And Lugosi was supposed to also do Frankenstein, and he walked out, which would have been a pure hell for Jack Pierce, because Lugosi refused to let Pierce do any makeup whatsoever, except for like a green grease paint, which would reflect back white. He was like, kid, I already did this on Broadway. We already know who he is. Don't crowd me. Get out of here. And Jack Pierce probably would have had no career whatsoever if Boris Karloff didn't actually end up being our guy. But the thing that I noticed about Dracula is that it suffers from being the first sound film so much. One of the things that they second guessed about was they didn't want to put music, a soundtrack in there, because they were afraid people would be confused. Wait a second, this is sound. Unless there was an orchestra playing, they wouldn't put any sound in there. The pacing is really slow. So, there you go. Marketing men just overthinking things. And so there's this real, it doesn't even feel like Browning. At many times, it's really Lugosi. Where I see Browning is in Renfield. Whenever Renfield's on the screen, it becomes a Tod Browning film again. And I think it really works very well in the very beginning, but it becomes immersed in the fact that they couldn't do certain things because of the code, and also the sound problem. They didn't know what to do with the sound, and the fact that they couldn't afford to make the movie they wanted to. They had to do the stage play, and it feels very, very much like a stage play. In the very beginning, when it feels like a silent film, when there's location shots, and when you're first seeing the castle, it's alive. And in fact, there's a great sense of humor to it. You see the coffins opening up, and there's even a coffin for a little spider, and the spider jumps out. And it's beautifully photographed, and Renfield's coming in here. And as soon as Renfield is taken out of the movie, it just kind of dies. It turns into a drama.
Yeah, it's a classic example of just how awkward the transition was from silence to sound. And back in the day, you watch like early Marx Brothers movies when they're running around, you can hear the feet banging on the stage floor, and it's like echoing. The sound was really, really horrible, because they would just basically hide a microphone behind a plant and then just turn them loose. And you do have a lot of that staginess. But I agree, there are a few sequences where we do see Browning really doing his thing. In the beginning, as they're all kind of waking up and starting their evening, I love how you see the three vampire women walking together. It's very ominous for me. And I love the confrontation at the very end between Dracula and Renfield. We have that great classic wide shot from way, way back of them on that enormous stairwell. So I feel like there are moments where Browning really gets to show off what he's got. But then there you also have a lot of scenes with a lot of people just standing around talking in rooms, hovering around, a chandelier or a lamp or a plant that's clearly got the microphone. And so I do like some of the confrontations between Van Helsing and Lugosi, but obviously it's Lugosi all the way in those moments. You're not getting Browning's magic. The magic is definitely missing on this film, and it's a weird irony that the film that he's most famous for is stylistically one of his least interesting, at least amongst the ones that we're talking about. And it's a shame that we will never know to what degree London After Midnight was successful or not. I know it had some bad reviews, but it was the most successful movie that Lon Chaney and Tod Browning ever collaborated on, and it obviously has vampire themes. Apparently the makeup was so garish and uncomfortable that Lon Chaney couldn't even wear it for long periods of time before he had to take everything off. I think there was a fire in the 60s at MGM that destroyed the last surviving print, so all we have are stills and these just astonishingly gorgeous atmospheric movie posters, and I'm a bit of a movie poster buff. So yeah, with Dracula, I enjoy Dracula. I like Dracula. I've seen it many times, but it is probably the reason why I did not see Tod Browning's silent movies for as long as I did, because I just wasn't as in love with it as I am with the James Whale. And so I guess maybe on one hand it was kind of a good thing, because here I am at age 40 discovering movies from the 20s that I'd never seen before that are phenomenal movies, so I got to kind of save a few treasures for later on in life. And I'm always worried that I watched too many classics and masterpieces in my early 20s, that I kind of deprived myself of a lot of great movie-going experiences later in life. But yeah, thankfully, there are always some gems waiting to be rediscovered.
Yeah, definitely. And Dracula has its moments. You mentioned where you have Van Helsing going against Dracula, and Edward Van Sloan does a fantastic job in that. And there's a great moment with a reveal of a mirror in a cigarette box. And that's where I really went, wow, there's some really delicate directing going on here. Because the way that the camera is positioned, the reverse angle of the mirror shot, then cross-cutting with the actual actors standing there. There's this great tension. And then, because it's a sound film, they repeat exactly what you just saw, which is like movie death. You don't tell people what you're doing. You actually show them what's going on. But the energy of the film, when it crackles, is really, really strong. Like you talked about the end with Renfield on this huge staircase, where there is this fear that he's going to die and he's going to be deserving of the pain of all the souls that he had taken off of the earth. If he stays under this guy, this romance, I think the real romance in that movie is Renfield and Dracula. He trusts this guy to do the right thing by him. He's going to give him rats and everything, but just make me immortal so I never have to feel the sting of what I've done to these people, how many people I betrayed. And what does Dracula do to him? He tells him, no, I'm going to kill you, and he kills him. He makes sure that he remembers that he's going to feel every one of those pains, and then he actually kills him. And that's gripping. That I felt that there was real emotion in that, and it was one of the few times that Dracula actually felt truly threatening. There's a moment when Dracula comes into the room and he's trying to get Van Helsing to come to him under his own will. And there's a moment there where Dracula really feels threatening. And those moments, unfortunately, are a little bit few and far between. They were too busy trying to make this kind of a romance in a weird way. They tried to make him a sexual beast. And in some ways that works, and in some ways it doesn't. When you cut away, every time somebody's laying on a bed, you don't really get the sexuality of it. But the idea of that you're going to pay for this someday kind of echoes through Dracula from beginning to end. And yet there's this whole thing of blood is life, and to die, to be really dead, that must be glorious. That's one of the things that Dracula says in the beginning when people are talking about the undead. And I just think about how in the end you hear Dracula groaning. Was that a groan of relief? Is it finally over?
Now, have you had a chance to see Tod Browning and Bela Lugosi's kind of unofficial follow-up to this with the Mark of the Vampire, which was a remake or a loose remake of London After Midnight.
I did not get to see it. I knew that it was a remake of it, but I had once again, every so often I hear how bad something is, and I just kind of go away from it. So I didn't go to it because, in a way, I kind of like the idea of London After Midnight being a forgotten masterpiece, and I didn't want to see a remake that was really, shoddy.
Yeah, that's the beautiful thing. I mean, not beautiful thing, but one of the side effects of lost movies or butchered old movies is that our imagination as cinephiles, we always presume it would have been this total undisputed masterpiece, whether it's Orson Welles in Magnificent Ambersons, which was famously cut against his will, or Erich von Stroheim in Greed, or a lost film like London After Midnight. Everyone operates under the assumption that it was like the greatest silent horror film ever made. That may or may not be the case, but yeah, Mark of the Vampire gives us an idea that perhaps it was not. But I don't know, Mark of the Vampire, Bela Lugosi barely speaks until the very end, and also the vampires in it are all part of an elaborate hoax for discovering a murder. It's basically a very, very elaborate scheme to find out who is a killer, and all the vampires just turn out to be actors. So it's kind of you feel betrayed at the end to find out that it's just Bela Lugosi pretending to be a vampire, and so that's the big knock against it. But in the silent film, Lon Chaney plays both the vampire and the investigator trying to solve the crime. So he gets to play two parts in the same movie. So I always hope that one day someone will dust off an old, forgotten print of London After Midnight and give us a chance to see it. But for now, our imagination will have to do.
Yeah, I think that Turner Classic Movies at one point, they had somebody try to make an animatic of it. In other words, they had scripts,
kind of a photographic reconstruction.
Yeah, and I couldn't make it through. It wasn't quite magical at that moment.
It's academic.
Yeah, in the end, it's quite academic. Of course, we just mentioned what's probably his most popular film, or most famous film. The next one is his most infamous, and it is he's one of only a handful of directors who were at a top of their game. In other words, they were really a well-known commodity. They were just coming off of a hit, and they crippled themselves and destroyed their careers with one single film. And Michael Powell in Peeping Tom would be one. Some could say John Carpenter after The Thing. His career was never the same. But true obliteration of a career happens for poor Tod Browning, going back to, quote-unquote, his roots. And in his silent films, several of his movies had to do with circus performers, but many of these were kind of a symptom of the problem, right? You have Lon Chaney playing a guy that has no legs instead of having a guy that has no legs in the movie. Tod Browning suddenly has this weird moment in his life where something that he has read, Todd Robbins, Spurs, a short story, inspires him to go back to his roots and tell a true relationship story in his movie Freaks. A notorious film, and even to this day, I watched it again, and I find myself torn by the film. In a way, it has it's this entrance way to a whole new era of cinema where you have the weird can actually be rejoiced upon instead of reviled, but he can't help but be an exploitive guy as well by the end of the film. So there is this weird half and half. He's straddling the line instead of crossing the line, and he gets it right in the nuts, quite honestly, because of that. So,
well, the first scene where we see a lot of the quote-unquote freaks, it's almost like they're like forest creatures, or these like really, really innocent, childlike beings out in the woods just playing and interacting. And it's a really spellbinding sequence, and it's kind of the mirror image of the dark side when they exact their revenge upon someone who had the audacity to try to harm one of their own, where they're depicted in a really terrifying light at the very end. But yeah, so like you said, it straddles that line. It tries to depict them as angelic, innocent creatures who are being attacked by the malicious, outwardly beautiful humans who are inwardly disgusting. And then but I can understand why this movie was misunderstood and people freaked out and why it disturbs people to this day. But I'm a big fan of cinematic oddities.
Same
and
here.
This movie is as odd as they come, and there's no other movie like it. And the first time I saw it, I mean, the climax wrecked me. It really had a massive, powerful impact on me. So I feel like anytime you make a movie that can be that emotionally staggering and that kind of controversial decades and decades and decades after its initial release, you're doing something special. So yeah, Freaks is definitely a kind of, not a neglected masterpiece because so many people love it and admire it, but I think a lot of people refuse to see it, and that's a shame.
Yeah, I mean, if they really took a look at it, I think they would find some real sensitive stuff, some really weird comedy as well, and then this really crazy. It's very schizophrenic in its own way. And what I like, you mentioned the very beginning, the first time that you see them, it's like this angelic moment. But the opening of the movie, how we talked about in the last episode where we talked about James Whale, and you had mentioned that you kind of get high when you see the card, the opening card, the title cards of the old 30s movies. And Freaks starts with this title card, which is then ripped apart by a hand that comes from behind.
Yeah, it's a drawing of all the freaks kind of around the word freaks. Yeah, and then it gets shredded. So it's a really dramatic directorial flourish on Tod Browning's part.
Yeah, it completely mesmerizes you and makes you retract. And the next thing that you see is the Carney Barker talking about this most horrible thing that we're going to see. And he talks about the law. And he talks about the law of the people who work in this circus, or the people who are of this type. And he says, their code is a law unto themselves. Offend one, and you offend them all. And that is, he's holding a torch, I think, at that time, or there is a torch in the background. You get this really, really moody feel that you're about to go into a really bizarre fairy tale, and you most certainly do. And yet, this is kind of like... I can't pronounce it correctly. I always fumble on it, but it was Louis Buñuel's movie set in Mexico City with the kids, the Goodbye Children.
Las Urdes.
Yes.
Land Without Bread. Yeah.
Land Without Bread.
These movies are often paired as a double feature by very, very creative programmers, and I think they work well together.
Yeah, they could be semi-documentaries. In fact, there are long passages of I almost call it spurs, of Freaks, where you are just getting involved in these relationships, these complex, sad relationships. And like most of Browning's films, the innocent are tortured. You have Hans's wife, who loves him, or not Frida. I don't think it's his wife; it's his girlfriend, I guess. She is also a dwarf. He is a dwarf. He falls for Cleopatra, this beautiful woman of the trapeze, but she's using him for money. And then when she finds out that he's got a secret treasure stashed, she uses her strongman boyfriend Hercules to poison this young man. First get him to marry her, bring her into the flock, and then poison him. And the one who suffers the most, you see the weird fantasy of Hans coming true. So he's blind to what's going on. But Frida sees everything, and we see not just her sighing, we get these slice of life moments with her talking to other freaks about it. And so it really starts to feel like a relationship drama. And there are several different relationships that are happening. Froso the clown. Once again, Froso. Froso's name is used twice in these movies. The Unknown was also Froso. So you have these conjoined twins, their relationship with a clown and another guy. And that one's played.
That's one of my favorite parts of the movie, the conjoined twins. I mean, because you see how, even in an environment as bizarre as this, how eventually, once you get married, you're gonna bicker and squabble just like any old couple. But it's, of course, It's interesting when you've got your wife is attached to another person, and so when they say, "Oh well, so and so needs to be somewhere else now," and they leave, it's like, "Oh, you always use that excuse." But I love how they make it seem so ordinary, even if it's extraordinary what we see on the screen.
Yeah, so they give you all of this happening. Browning spends probably half of the movie giving us slice of life with these people and enjoying them and giving people close-ups. So like you mentioned, where they were sitting on someone's land by a little pond and the people come running, screaming at them, and all the freaks suddenly get up and they start running towards their matron, this woman who's standing there, and she explains what's going on, and then the guy goes, oh, okay, you guys can stay. You see them in this angelic way, and then you get these close-ups of them frightened. And each and every one of them gets a shot. And then at the end of that, the matron basically says, shame on you. You should never be afraid. Never show them that you're afraid. God loves all of his children. He looks after all of them, and they all hug. And how can you not feel something for these guys? And then things get dark. And then you have this moment, and it all happens around a wedding feast. And the wedding feast is well known even by people who have never seen this movie, even if they've watched The Simpsons or anything like this. It's the loving cup. So there is the wedding finally of Hans and Cleopatra. And they're such redolent people, her and Hercules, that they can't even keep their guys up during the wedding ceremony or the wedding feast. They're
pure
joking.
scum.
Yeah, pure scum, laughing and cajoling. They really don't see anything wonderful about these people at all. But the freaks are, and calling them freaks seems a little bit weird in and of itself, but these people are, pull out a loving cup of wine, I guess, and they go to each one of them, and the idea is, if you will allow this person in, you will drink of this drink. So they put it in front of each and every one of these people. No matter what their deformity, they're ready to take her in. They drink. Why? Not because they like her, not because they don't think that she's skimming money, because he loves her. And he's one of
And I love how they
theirs.
say, we accept her, like one of us. I mean, everyone always quotes one of us, but the line it always follows that is, we accept her. And I think it's so fascinating that while outwardly she is very, very beautiful, and you think she's kind of like, would be like, it would be her job to accept them. Like, I love the role reversal. The freaks are coming together and say, no, we accept her.
Right.
But I think it's a very interesting thing. Like, they have the capacity to accept people who are different from how they are, whereas she obviously totally lacks that in in the reverse.
Exactly, and that's one of the big moments in this film is you have one of the freaks holding this cup, and he's standing on top of the table, and they're all saying, we accept her, and she's getting upset. She sees that cup is coming to her lips, and you can see her getting more and more repulsed. She's got a fortune riding on this. All she has to do is pretend. And she is so revulsed by these folks, and allegedly she's drunk, and that's why she goes down that path. But she completely blows it. She blows the whole scheme, and then they have to strong-arm this guy for a little bit because she can't stand it. She goes, make me one of you? And so she gets exactly what you were talking about. They are, okay, fine, we're going to be okay with you. And it's like the indignancy that you have to actually even try to make me one of you. And then she's like, dirty, slimy freaks. And there's this shot. They don't even show her action, but you know exactly what happens, that she throws this wine and she splashes all the freaks, especially the one that's standing there in a suit, and his eyes just close. And he just stands there and he slowly sways just a little bit. And they all start getting up and leaving. And it's absolutely heartbreaking. But the darkness is coming, and we know that it's coming. And from here on out, we've had this last heroic moment of what the freaks will look like. And now it starts to change. They start to change into like hitmen. There are these really weird camera angles where people are hiding underneath stairs, just watching. People are cleaning knives and whistling. And there is a palpable sense of fear. And part of that is because
but to
we
be
are
fair,
afraid.
we don't see the weapons until it becomes public knowledge that the girl's trying to poison Hans. So as much as they might be depicted in kind of a frightening way, at that point, I felt such murderous hatred toward the girl for trying to poison this innocent, naive, kind of helpless guy who allowed himself to be taken in just by essentially his lust, that when I see these guys sharpening knives and whatnot, I feel totally morally justified. I'm so on board and on their side that I have a hard time. It's almost like they become, for me, they become almost kind of heroic, even though they are depicted in kind of a terrifying, disturbing way as you see like the murderous side coming out. But I feel like they're circling the wagons to protect one of their own.
And I agree. I think that at that point, it's until the carriage actually crashes in the rainstorm. Up until then, it is, hey, if these guys were not freaks, you'd be like going, more power to them. This is the law of the circus. You screw with one of us, you screw with all of us. And I love when they're inside of Hans's carriage and one of them is playing an instrument and he starts playing foreboding music. He starts going brr, 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 as
Great
things
scene.
get more and more tense. It's amazing. But then the carriage breaks and everybody sprawls out into the rain. And this is some of the most terrifying looking shots. There's no getting around the fact that these shots are there to scare you. There's the last shot of Cleopatra where she's running in the woods and she's screaming for Hans and she turns around and the human torso jumps over a tree root with a knife in his teeth and she screams. Still gave me chills after all of this time.
I mean, even the one who has no limbs at all is in on it. I mean, he's kind of just rolling along underneath. I mean,
yes,
it's incredible stuff, and it's some of the most terrifying imagery ever committed to movies. Maybe almost more terrifying than Tod Browning even meant to. I mean, I'm sure he wanted it to be scary, but it's eerily powerful stuff just because it's all caught in camera. There are no special effects at play, and when the strong man gets the knife in the side and he's bleeding out and he's being hunted down, I mean, you feel a tiny twinge of pity for this horrible, horrible piece of shit, but on the other hand, I feel like he gets what he deserves. But what really disturbs him is when you see how the girl in the equation ends up, and that, I mean, granted, you want something bad to happen to her, you feel like she's got whatever's coming to her, that's what she deserves. However, I don't know why it affected me so much. Some people laugh when they see the final shot of her as a kind of as a curiosity, but for me, for whatever reason, I found it intensely disturbing, and I've never quite shaken just how disturbing that first impression was when I first saw her.
Oh yeah, I had a horror book, a reference book that had a picture of her in that chicken woman moment. And I had to pass it over because it really, really bothered me. It's what it really represents. And it even says something terrible about them. You want to be a freak? We'll make you a real freak. The things that they hate about being different, they actually use as a torture, a punishment for this person, and they keep her around. They don't kill her. Yeah. They keep her around. And so it's very EC Comics, but it is a truly disturbing end. Fitting. I mean, it's funny in a way. It is like a EC Comics thing where it's that gallows humor. But it's just so terrible to think of that it's such an end that I think that's why you have that tacked on end. That should be the end of the movie, right? That's the end of the EC comic. But instead, we have reconciliation with Hans.
Yeah, people would have had heart attacks. If that was the very last scene, people would have committed suicide. Like they would not have been able to handle an ending that bleak.
But here's a guy that a lot of people don't know, Tod Browning, and we've just talked about several of his films, and the words that we're using is impacting, brutal, scary, ahead of his time, controversial, and he's worth people knowing a little bit more about. So, James, I want to thank you so much for giving this man his due, talking a little bit more about these movies, and just in essence, helping bring this double feature to a close. Can you give people a little bit of an understanding of how they can listen to your first piece?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you for agreeing. I mean, I feel like we kind of came up with this double feature together, so I feel like it's been a really, really cool, fun experiment, and hopefully we can find other interesting double feature experiments to do in the future. And also, I mean, for a guy who sometimes has the foolish idea that I'm running out of classic movies to discover, preparing for this episode was a brutal reminder, not a brutal reminder, a very friendly reminder that there are always brilliant movies waiting to be rediscovered if you dig. And like if you go on an archaeological dig through film history, there are masterpieces waiting to be dusted off and reassessed and reappraised. And hopefully this episode will help people want to go back and watch The Unknown and watch West of Zanzibar, which I feel like are two genuine forgotten classics that are well worth anybody's time and energy, whether you're a casual fan of old movies or one of the most hardcore film-obsessed cinephiles imaginable. But if you want to hear more of me ranting and raving about movies, you can check out Wrong Reel on iTunes or Stitcher Radio or Google Play Music. Please give us a subscribe if you feel so inclined. Or you can find us on Twitter and Facebook, just Wrong Reel. Or you can find me on Twitter at Colbrax, where I pretty much live there day and night talking about films with people. So I'm very easy to find and hunt down. So I'm just at Colbrax. And give me a shout. I love to hear from film freaks of all shapes and sizes.
Fantastic. Thanks again for being on. And as mentioned by James, we have part 1 on the Wrong Reel podcast. We'll have plenty of links for that. And we'll also have this second part here. Hopefully you'll enjoy being able to listen to this double feature with 2 different podcasts, and maybe even expand your listening habits to include both of us. I hope everybody out there is enjoying this show. James, once again, thanks so much for being here, and to everybody out there, stay hellbent. And thanks for listening to my show. I'd love to hear back from you. You can email me directly at scott@hellbentforhorror.com, and I've also updated my Hellbent for Horror website, hellbentforhorror.com. You can download every episode directly from there, read any newsletters, and you can go to any of my social websites and emails, all from the homepage. You can IM me on my Facebook page at facebook.com/hellbentforhorror, and you can find me on Twitter at hellbenthorror. A lot of the great conversations I have with fans happens on Twitter at hellbenthorror. Now, for you, the listeners of Hellbent for Horror, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out their service. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/hellbentforhorror. If you like the show and you're curious about audiobooks, sign up for the service through Hellbent for Horror. It helps make this podcast sustainable for me. I thank you in advance. And thank you for listening, folks. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can now subscribe to the Hellbent for Horror podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Player FM, and Stitcher. And if you like the show, please consider writing a review on iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play. It really helps. Till next time, stay hellbent.